Welcome back to the channel, my friends. Warhammer Man Studios. I'm Warhammer Man, and today we're going to be taking a look at Zenithal priming and basing. We're going to look at some various techniques, including the addition of color, and talk about the difference between airbrushing and using rattle can spray. So if you might be interested in this, make sure to stay tuned. This video is sponsored by CMO Games. More on that later. Alright, so recently I did a little trade online with a stranger who also likes toy soldiers, and I traded him some of my toy soldiers for some of his toy soldiers. And these are the ones I got. So it is one of the big mega gargants as well as two of the small little guys. And honestly, the models are super cool. Unfortunately, the guy I got them from had partially painted the smaller gargants and also primed the larger gargant, but did not clean up the mold lines. They were otherwise built rather nicely, but the issue was the mold lines were very, very evident. So I went ahead and decided that I was going to have to scrape all the mold lines. So I went through and did that. And then afterwards, I decided I was going to do a nice little zenithal on them and then just kind of go from there. So the idea behind zenithal priming, or essentially the technique of zenithal painting, you're basically just trying to emulate the sun or like natural light source. So you can also use zenithal in different ways, but essentially that's the basic meaning of it. Now, normally what you'll see is a black and white zenithal. You can get fancy with a gray in there as well, or just do some transitions. You can use a rattle can, or you can use an airbrush. Obviously, anything with the airbrush is going to be a little bit better, but overall you can get some nice effects with a rattle can. So we'll look at a few different examples. One where I do some with the rattle can, like this one. Some where I do airbrush as well. And then some where I do just basic different colors for the actual zenithal. And then some where I do more like targeted spraying as well with the airbrush. So just starting off here with our big guy, he was basically primed from the top, but didn't do a very good job. It looked like he was basically mounted to the base, and the base was blocking a lot of the primer. So I knew I was going to have to rebase this guy and then also just repaint him. But the main goal with the zenithal is to essentially just lay out the basic muscle tones or like textures, as well as like the shadowing that is naturally cast by the light source. So in this case, the light that I have for shooting the video is basically pointed down directly at this guy's forehead, the same way the sun would theoretically be pointed down if he was moving towards that light source. But the key with zenithal highlighting is when you start to look at him from different areas, like below or directly above, you see a much more uniform color. So that's what we're going to go ahead and take a look at. And then we're going to look at the limitations that it presents and kind of compare those to the airbrush stuff as well. All right, so here with our big guy, the Mega Gargant, when we look at him from this regular angle, we can kind of see some shadows that are cast by the zenithal highlighting that we did. And this is a super basic technique. The only thing I did to get started was I primed the model from underneath completely black, and then also from the top as well. And then I went back afterwards and I primed him again with white, but only from sort of like the forward kind of angle, a little bit on the back and everything like that. But I wanted to focus the light source towards like his forehead basically. So the goal with the zenithal highlight is to essentially put in like shadows naturally that something might have in the real world to give it more of a regular effect. If we just uniformly paint the whole thing black or the whole thing white, we lose a lot of like the shadows and volume and everything. And that's what we're trying to capture with the zenithal highlight. So as we shift the model towards the camera lens, we can see it's almost completely white from the top. And as we slowly shift it back in the opposite direction and look at it from underneath, we can see the model turns almost completely black. And that is the effect of the zenithal highlight in its most basic form. And when I say basic form, I mean this was just done basically with a can of spray primer. And there's no actual like targeted light or anything like that. It's literally just sprayed down from the top. So we can see some areas where it's a little bit speckly, a little bit dirty, but overall nice effect. So this is basically what you can expect to get on a large model using zenithal highlighting with black and white only from a spray can. All right, so now here we have another model. This is a slight conversion I did for a zombie dragon. And this one, I've done the same exact technique, but this time I used the airbrush to do the white highlight or the zenithal lighting portion. So it's still sprayed using a can black spray primer, and then afterwards I left it completely black, and then I just hit it with a few layers of the airbrush. Alright, so here we have our zombie dragon. From the top we can see it's almost completely white, and as we shift it towards looking from the top towards looking from the bottom, we can see we start to get that darker effect underneath, just emulating the natural shadows, assuming that we have a primary light source like the sun. So here we can see this is much less speckly than the giant is, and that was done with the primer spray can, as where this was done with an Iwata Neo airbrush. So you can see the transitions in between the actual white and the black itself are much more creamy and much more subtle. And I think the main thing is you just don't get the speckles that you normally get from the spray can, because this is giving more of a even mist, as where the can is just doing its best. Alright, so now we're going to look at something a little bit different. Now with this model, I started off with a purple instead of black for the base coat, and then I used essentially like lighter and lighter flesh tones to do the zenithal with, and then I also used the airbrush to do some targeted highlight areas as well. So when we look at it from the bottom, we can see that purple color down in the shadows. And as we sort of transition, we see the skin tone, and then eventually the lighter skin tone airbrushed on highlights as well. And now because I wanted a different gradient with this model, I didn't want it to be pure white from the top, because that takes away from some of the actual like spotted highlights that I put in there as well with the airbrush. So essentially I have done like a little lighter on the face, on the claws, some of like the little bat wing kind of fleshy bits, and like the very tip of the fur as well. So this is a slightly more advanced technique. This one requires the airbrush, and now we're adding in not only color, but also some targeted areas as well. And now a quick message from this week's sponsor. This video is sponsored by cmogames.com, where you can get 15% off most Games Workshop pre-orders, and they go live right at midnight Saturday mornings. cmogames.com offers free shipping on orders over $25 in the US 48, and most orders ship within 24 hours. cmogames.com has been selling Games Workshop products online for more than 20 years, and customer service is their top priority. cmogames.com carries the full line of Games Workshop products, including 40K, Age of Sigmar, Kill Team, warcry, paints, hobbies, and tools. Visit cmogames.com using the affiliate link in the description below so they know you heard about cmogames.com from Warhammer Man Studios. Now, back to the video. And this type of priming technique is ideal for things like contrast paints or speed paints. You could even use this technique and go through afterwards and then do some dry brushed on highlights and essentially go for the slap chop method if you wanted. But the truth is, this gives you a little more creamy of a look and a little less of that kind of like chalky lininess. So I like this instead of something like a slap chop. Alright, so on to our little giant buddies here now. This is a combination of those techniques. Now please keep in mind these models were already partially painted, so you can see some colors on like the scaly arm guard and the pants and stuff like that. Just kind of ignore that. And I also went through afterwards and brushed on some silver as well, so you can kind of see a couple areas where I did that, just because I had a little extra on my palette and didn't want it to go to waste. So with these guys, essentially we're going to ignore the fact that I went through and scraped out the mold lines and that they were already kind of painted, and just focus on what I did with the flesh. So all I did here was I started with an undercoat of like a darker flesh, and then I just progressively worked to a lighter flesh, and then I went through afterwards with the airbrush and I specifically picked out areas where I wanted it to be brighter. So essentially I used the gravity effect of the Zenithal highlighting technique, and then afterwards I kind of went in and tweaked it with my own judgment. So let's take a closer look at these guys and see what I'm talking about. Alright, so they're obviously not perfect and they have been repainted, but essentially I just started with that dark color underneath again, that dark skin color, and then I went and did a lighter color from the top in our standard Zenithal fashion, but I used the flesh color instead of just a regular white. And as I got progressively lighter and lighter, I achieved the basic Zenithal highlight. And then I went through afterwards with the airbrush and sort of picked out some specific areas like the pec muscles and the stomach, and just kind of made those a little lighter and did the transition. But as we kind of get that underneath angle there, you can see the darker flesh tones in there. You can also see some of the old paint that didn't get covered up by the Zenithal highlight of the flesh. So obviously these guys aren't perfect, but they look much better than they did before. And once I do get a nice paint job on them, they should look really nice. So here's our other buddy, and when we look at him from this angle, we can see that Bugman's, that real dark flesh tone. And then as we sort of shift him up to the top, he gets progressively lighter and lighter until eventually when we look at him almost like straight down or looking at him from his forehead, you can kind of see it's almost a white color. Now there's still a little bit of fleshiness to it, and I do intend to use that flesh tone, but I'm going to do some glazing techniques for like various reds, purples, different colors to kind of accent the blood flow and, you know, various areas of aggravation or rashes, so to speak. But the idea being that now I have a nice base with some variation in color, and it kind of picks out some of the natural areas for me. And then I can just kind of go in and work those areas and the built-in detail as well as the shadows to kind of get a double bonus effect. So this type of thing here doesn't take long at all, and it doesn't take a ton of skill either. You can do this type of thing pretty quickly with just a little bit of practice. And honestly, if you slap a little color on the pants and just kind of cleaned it up a little bit, you could actually rock something like this out, especially if you went through and based it. And oftentimes you'll see people will get tabletop ready armies with an airbrush pretty simply and pretty quickly, because when you're doing sort of like an assembly line on a bunch of guys, it goes by very quickly. So that is basically it. Just wanted to show off some of the basics of Zenithal priming and highlighting, and just kind of show how far you can take it with just an airbrush over a couple cans of spray paint or just the addition of a little bit of color. The truth is, even if you're not going to use some kind of translucent paints like contrast or speed paints, you can still use this technique, and it really helps to train your eye as to where your shadow should be and things like that. So even if you're using a traditional kind of like block and wash then highlight type method, or if you're using a little more of like that kind of slap chop look, you can get away with doing this type of technique and make all your models look better, or at least save yourself some work. I think it's pretty clear that the Rattle can definitely achieve some nice effects, but that the airbrush is exponentially better at this. Also, using inks in your airbrush instead of paint also works extremely well, because the pigment doesn't get clogged up in the same way that sometimes your paints will. So if you're not using inks already and you want to get those super creamy blends, I definitely recommend checking out those inks. If you've never used any of these techniques before, I can understand how it might look intimidating, but with a little bit of practice, you'd be really surprised how awesome things look. And even when you use just a couple of Rattle cans and you do a black primer and then a white Zenithal, I think you'd be really surprised how awesome something can look just with a prime, and then how excited you'll get to actually get in there and start putting some actual paint on it. So we have a few techniques demonstrated in this video. We did just Rattle can only Zenithal. We did Zenithal using the Rattle can and the airbrush, and then we did the multicolored Zenithal as well with some targeted highlights. And then finally for the little giants, we went through and just really did a nice Zenithal targeted combination with some cool and creamy blends. Special thanks to CMO Games for sponsoring the video. Check out their link in the description to save 15%. That's it for today, Warhammer Man Studios. I'm Warhammer Man, and I'm out of here.